Hello everyone and welcome to this week's ExtendScript tutorial. In this one I'm going to show you how to easily render any format from After Effects using a script. So all you have to do is have a composition open in After Effects, and once you run the script it's going to launch Media Encoder, which will of course allow you to render pretty much any format that you need, and it's then going to format and render in the last thing you selected. So basically it's a little bit of a cheat where what we're going to do is essentially bring in an element, and we're going to select the format that we want to export using the script. So say I wanted to export a GIF, all I need to do is change it to a GIF and delete it, because now it's going to be set as the default. So if I have Adobe Media Encoder closed and I go ahead and run the script again, it's going to load up Media Encoder with the format we selected and then render out whatever video or image we give it into that format. So it's a little bit of a trick, and it's something I do with most of my scripts when I write for freelancing and for other things when people need to render out to any format, because of course there is limitations in the newest versions of After Effects of what you can render out, so you may want very specific formats. And to do that, we'll be using Media Encoder and this script as well. So let's go ahead and get started by creating a new JavaScript file and zooming in a little bit so we can see better. What we're going to do first is create a function which is going to essentially take whatever our composition we give it and it's going to render it out. We're just going to build the framework right now, so we'll call it AME render. And of course I forgot to add function first. We're defining a new function, and needs to have these brackets to enclose where all the code inside of it's going to go, and for an argument we need to give it a composition, so we'll just call it comp. And then outside we need to sort of call the function so that we can run it, and we also need to give it a composition. So I'll create a variable called project equal to app.project, and then we're going to assume the user has a composition open, so I'm going to say this comp is equal to our project.activeItem, and that active item is going to be when you have it selected here. And then all we're going to do is run this AME render function, and you can see as we type it in, it tells us we need to give it a composition, so I'm going to give it this comp. So now just to make sure everything is working, I'm going to, inside of the AME render, say right line our comp.name to make sure we're getting the right comp. And as you can see in our JavaScript console, we get 5,000 stars, which is the name of this composition. So all we need to do now is essentially take this composition, add it to the Adobe After Effects render queue, and then we're going to change the path of it to be wherever we want, which is one of the nice things about scripting is we can save things in batch form to different paths automatically. So we can give it the custom path we want and the custom name, and then we're going to essentially push it and make sure Media Encoder is open and then render immediately. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new bridge talk object called BT and just say new bridge talk. We're also going to need parentheses, as that is an object we need to create. And then below that, I'm going to create the variable for the path of where I want this video to be rendered to, or whatever we want to render to. And I'm going to set that equal to now for my desktop. And then we're going to have an if statement. We're going to check if Adobe Media Encoder is running. And if it's not, then we need to go ahead and launch it to make sure that we can properly push the composition into it and render it. So what I'm going to say is if bridge talk dot is running, and inside of is running we need to give it the program name, which in this case is AME for Adobe Media Encoder. But this is saying if Adobe Media Encoder is indeed running, because this would return true. So to check the opposite, we're just going to put in an exclamation mark to invert it. So we're going to say if it's not running, then we're going to do something. And what we're going to do is take our bridge talk object here and say launch. We're going to tell it what application we want to launch, again Adobe Media Encoder, and then you can also give it something like background, so it will launch in the background if you want. And just so the user knows we're going to be launching an application without asking, I'm going to alert that we're launching Adobe Media Encoder and that it's required for the proper rendering. So I'm going to launch it and then alert to them. So if I go ahead and close Adobe Media Encoder and run this script, you can see we're going to get that message saying Adobe Media Encoder is required, and as that's happening, it's also launching the program in the background. So now we can go over putting the composition into the render queue and then transferring that over to Adobe Media Encoder since it's open now. The first thing I'm going to do is create a variable called renderQueueItem and set this equal to our app.project.renderQueue, which is representative of this whole render queue object and window. And we're going to say .items, and we're going to add our comp. So if we go ahead and test this out, Yes, we know Adobe Media Encoder is going to launch, but we're also going to shoot the composition over here into the render queue. Now what we need to do is change the location where it's going to be saved to be wherever we want. And we already have a path variable for this. So the way we actually need to modify this is get access to this output module. The output module contains both the format and the path of where this is going to be saved to. So I'm going to create a variable called module and set this equal to our render queue item. And then the way we get the output module is say output module index 1. You can have multiple output modules, so if you wanted to render something in different formats, you could select different outputs and then different file formats. But in our case, we just have one we need in order to send it to Adobe Media Encoder. In the scripting guide, we can actually go find the output module here and go to that page. And you can see we have access to the file, the post-render action, the name, the template, and some other information. So what we want to do is actually change the file, which will contain both the path and the name of our desired output file. So what I'll do is say module.file, and I'm going to set this equal to a new file object that we're going to define here. And this is going to be our path that we set up here, so our desktop. And we're going to add a name to it. Let's go ahead and just add our composition.name. And then we also need to add a slash in here to separate the desktop, add a slash there, and then add the composition name. So in this case, it would say like desktop and then 5,000 stars, and then it would tack on whatever format we're exporting, which in After Effects doesn't matter. So now let's go ahead and run this and see how it's working. Go ahead and select our comp and run. So now it's been added to the queue, and if we click on this to see where it's been saved to, it's now pointing to our desktop, and it's using the composition name as well. So the last thing we need to do, the last line of code, is to say app.project.renderQueue, and we're going to use the action called queue in AME. And then we can also tell it true or false whether we want it to initiate the rendering process or not. So if we say true, it's going to start rendering as soon as it receives an item. And say it was already rendering and we sent in another file, it would continue rendering. If it was the first time and we said false, it's not going to render a video file immediately. But since we've already set up the location and all that, we're going to say true. So I'll go ahead and close Media Encoder and remove my render queue item. And now we're going to try the script that it should be done. It's going to tell us that it's launching Adobe Media Encoder. Over here in After Effects, it's gone ahead and launched that, and you can see it's unchecked. And as you can see, it's been sent off to Adobe Media Encoder to be rendered in the last format you selected. So just again to recap, to render any format out of After Effects using this script, all you have to do is set the format inside of Adobe Media Encoder by importing any file, changing it to what format you want to export to, and then you can go ahead and run the script and export any video in that format, and as many videos of course as you would want. But that's going to do it for this week's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to hit subscribe down below and the thumbs up icon as well. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below. If you haven't already, make sure you follow us on GitHub and Instagram. Both links are in the description down below. And of course, I hope you guys enjoyed. We'll see you in the next one.